Lian Huazhao was 22, newly arrived, and dressed in the plainest finery her careful hands could keep clean. A white prairie dress with a high collar that made her look even more composed than she felt, and a ribbon at her throat that trembled when the wind worried it. She stood at the edge of the station platform with a single trunk, a travel-worn satchel, and a marriage paper folded so many times the creases had become permanent. The land beyond the rails looked like it could swallow a person, all pale grass and distant timber, and the sky carried a gray weight that made even midday feel late. The man who came for her had the look of a rancher who had learned to survive without asking the world for kindness, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and quiet in a way that forced a room to lower its voice. "Miss Zhao," he said, and the formality sounded practiced, as if he had rehearsed the words on the ride over. "I am Elias Mercer." He did not offer flowery praise, and he did not pretend her fear was not visible, because his gaze was too steady to be careless. Lian forced her fingers to release the trunk handle. "Mr. Mercer," she answered, and her English carried the clean, careful shapes of language learned under pressure, because mistakes had cost her safety before. The station master watched them with the curiosity of a man starving for gossip, and Lian felt that attention like a cold hand at her back. She had told herself, for months, that marrying a poor rancher would be a doorway out of the past, a straight road into honest hardship that at least belonged to her. Elias's clothing seemed to confirm it. A dark coat repaired at the elbow, boots scuffed by long miles, and gloves worn thin at the knuckles. Yet his eyes did not belong to a poor man who feared bills, because they held the guarded patience of someone who feared memories instead. Elias lifted her trunk without strain and set it in a wagon that looked older than it should have been, as if he had chosen it on purpose. "The ride is not short," he said. "If you are tired, you may rest." Lian climbed in, the white folds of her prairie dress gathering around her like a fragile shield. "I will not sleep," she replied, because she did not trust roads she did not know. Elias clicked his tongue and the horses began. For a time there was only the creak of wheels and the steady rhythm of travel, until the land changed into rolling rises and low, stubborn trees. Lian watched everything, because she had learned that danger often arrived wearing ordinary clothes. After a long silence, she said softly, "Your letter said you are not wealthy." Elias's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with something like calculation. "My letter said I live simply," he corrected, and his voice was so controlled that it sounded almost gentle. Lian looked at his hands on the reins and saw faint scars that did not come from honest ranch work alone. "And the woman before me?" she asked, because she had heard whispers even before she boarded the ship. "The one who answered your first notice." Elias's shoulders went rigid, and the wagon seemed to roll into thicker air. "There was no wife before you," he said, too quickly, and then, as if the lie tasted bitter, he added, "There was a woman who considered it." Lian's stomach tightened. "And what happened to her?" Elias stared forward, the horizon swallowing his expression. "She died," he said, and the words fell like a stone dropped into deep water. Lian did not know whether to believe him, but she felt, with sick certainty, that the truth was worse than the sentence he offered. The Mercer house rose from the prairie like a dark thought, built of heavy timber and stone that looked out of place in the open land, and it did not feel like a home so much as a fortress that had learned to pretend. Lian had imagined a small ranch house, a kitchen that smelled of stew, a porch that creaked with simple life, but this place sat behind iron gates and a winding drive lined with leafless trees that reached like pleading arms. The horses slowed as if they, too, disliked crossing that threshold. Elias spoke only once as they approached. "Whatever you see," he said, "do not judge it quickly." Lian's breath caught, because the gates opened not with the strain of manual chains, but with the practiced efficiency of a man in livery, and that single detail cracked her expectations like ice underfoot. A servant, stiff as a carved post, took her trunk without meeting her eyes. Another appeared to help her down, and his hands were careful with her, but his attention darted to Elias as though permission was required for every movement. Lian stepped onto the gravel in her white prairie dress and felt suddenly foolish, like a sparrow dressed for a storm. "Mr. Mercer," a woman's voice called, sharp with control and polished like a knife. Abigail Mercer descended the front steps with the measured grace of someone who believed the world existed to be managed. Her hair was pinned in a severe style that did not allow stray softness, and her black dress looked as expensive as mourning. She studied Lien the way a banker studies a contract. "So you are the bride," Abigail said, not as a welcome but as a conclusion. Lien held her chin steady. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, because she had learned that dignity was sometimes the only armor available. Abigail's gaze flicked to Elias. "Inside," she ordered, as if he were a boy returning late from mischief. Elias did not argue, but his eyes met Lien's for a brief moment, and in that glance she saw apology without explanation. The interior swallowed them into dim warmth and oppressive beauty, with rich rugs, portraits of stern men, and heavy curtains that kept the daylight out as if it were an intruder. Lien's footsteps sounded too small on the polished floor. Abigail turned to her with a false softness that felt worse than cruelty. "You are far from home," she said. "You will learn quickly that our family does not indulge weakness." Lien's fingers curled against her skirt. "I did not come to be indulged," she answered, and her voice did not shake, though her pulse did. Abigail's eyes narrowed, then lifted slightly in what might have been approval or calculation. "Good," Abigail said. "Then you will not embarrass us." Lien glanced toward the walls, because the portraits seemed to watch her like witnesses who could not speak. Elias cleared his throat. "Mother, she is tired," he said, and the word mother carried more strain than affection. Abigail's expression barely changed. "Tiredness is not a condition to advertise," she replied. "She will be shown her room, she will wash, and then she will join us for supper." A young woman appeared at the end of the corridor, pale and frightened. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles shone. She could not have been older than 17. When her eyes met Lien's, she flinched as if Lien's presence confirmed something she had hoped was untrue. The girl hurried forward and dipped a nervous curtsy. "I am Clara Mercer," she said softly. "Elias is my brother." Lien managed a polite smile. "I am Lianhua Zhao," she said. And then, because the shortened name felt safer, she added, "You may call me Lien." Clara's gaze flicked over Lien's white prairie dress and then to the shadows of the hallway, as though something might step out if she looked too long. "Please," Clara whispered, barely moving her lips. "Do not go into the West Wing at night." Lien's blood cooled. "Why?" she whispered back, but Clara only shook her head, eyes wet with fear. Abigail's voice cut through them. "Clara," she snapped, "do not burden our guest with childish fancies." Clara's shoulders crumpled inward. Elias's jaw tightened again, and Lien realized that in this house, silence was not peace, but a rule enforced by fear. Supper was a ceremony disguised as a meal, and every chair seemed assigned by invisible law. Abigail sat at the head of the table, a queen without warmth, while Elias took the seat closest to her, as though proximity allowed supervision. Lien sat where a servant directed her, and she could not miss how the staff moved quietly, eyes down, as though sound itself could be punished. The silverware shone, the plates were fine porcelain, and the food was rich in a way that did not belong to a struggling ranch, and yet Elias wore the same repaired coat, as if he were determined to keep one lie alive even while surrounded by the evidence of another. A man joined them late, carrying the smell of smoke and ink, with a neat beard and the smooth manner of a professional who had never touched honest dirt. "Silas Crow," he introduced himself, bowing slightly to Lien, and his smile did not reach his eyes. "I assist Mrs. Mercer with the family's affairs." Abigail's mouth tightened at the word assist, as if she disliked any suggestion that she needed help, but she allowed it. Elias's gaze hardened. "He is our lawyer," Elias said simply, and the bluntness was a warning. Silas lifted his hands in a placating gesture. "A manager of details," he said, and his tone implied that details were weapons when properly arranged. Lien ate slowly, tasting very little, because the air felt crowded with unspoken meanings. Abigail watched her with cold interest. "You read and write," Abigail said, not as a question but as an assessment. Lien set down her fork carefully. "Yes, ma'am," she answered. Abigail's eyes sharpened. "In English," Abigail pressed. Lien met her gaze. In English, she confirmed, and then added. And in Chinese. Silas's eyebrows lifted in faint amusement. How useful, he murmured as though measuring her value. Elias's hand tightened around his glass. She is my wife, not a tool, he said, and though his voice remained controlled, a dangerous edge surfaced. Abigail's expression did not soften. A wife is a responsibility, she replied. And responsibilities have functions. Lien's throat tightened, but she kept her posture composed. I came here to build a life, she said, choosing every word with care. Not to be counted like property. Abigail's lips curved in a smile that contained no kindness. You will learn, she said, and then she turned her gaze to Elias. And you, Abigail continued, will learn to control what you invite into this house. Elias's gaze flicked to Lien, and the brief look carried something that felt disturbingly like regret. Clara sat farther down the table, barely touching her food, and when she thought Abigail was not watching, she slid a small folded paper beneath Lien's plate with trembling fingers. Lien's heart hammered, but she did not react, because she understood that survival sometimes required pretending not to notice. After supper, when Abigail and Silas withdrew into a study with a locked door, Elias walked Lien toward the stairs. The hallway lamps cast soft light that made the shadows deeper. I am sorry, Elias said quietly, and the words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, as if apologies were not allowed in his world. Lien stopped on the stair, her white prairie dress brushing the wood like a whisper. You said you lived simply, she replied, keeping her voice calm. This is not simple. Elias's eyes darkened. The house is not mine, he said, and it was not true, or it was only partly true, but he said it as if he needed it to be true. Lien's fingers slid beneath her plate paper now tucked in her palm. Then who owns it? She asked. Elias hesitated, and that hesitation told her more than any answer could. The Mercer name owns many things, he said at last. That is the problem. Lien looked up at him, and for the first time she saw, beneath the brooding control, the outline of a man trapped inside walls built by others. And what do you own? She asked softly. Elias leaned closer, lowering his voice as if the house itself listened. I own my mistakes, he said, and I intend to keep you alive through them. The sentence should have comforted her, but it chilled her, because it implied a threat already on the move. Lien did not sleep, not truly, because the Mercer house breathed at night, settling and creaking as though it were alive, and the wind pressed against the windows with restless insistence. She sat in a high-backed chair by the lamp, her white prairie dress loosened at the collar but still carefully arranged, because she felt safer when she looked prepared. In her hands she unfolded Clara's note, and the handwriting was rushed, uneven, as if written with shaking fingers. It said only, "She did not die on the road. Do not trust the study." Lien's skin prickled. She read it again, then folded it smaller and hid it in the lining of her satchel. The words struck at the story Elias had given her, and yet she did not know whether to blame him, because the house contained too many actors and too many locked doors. In the early hours she heard footsteps in the corridor, measured and purposeful, and she extinguished the lamp, moving to the door without opening it. A low murmur drifted from beyond, Silas Crow's voice and Abigail's clipped replies, and then, like a blade sliding free, she heard her own name. She must sign, Silas said. Abigail answered, She will. Once she understands the cost of refusal. Lien's breath caught. She stepped back, heart pounding, because she realized she had been brought here not only as a bride, but as a key. When morning finally came, the sky was the color of tarnished silver, and the house felt colder than it should have. Elias met her at breakfast with the same controlled expression, but his eyes looked bruised by sleeplessness. There is something you should see, he said, and his tone carried the careful firmness of a man who had reached a decision overnight. Abigail was absent, and that absence felt like permission granted under protest. Lien followed Elias outside, the skirt of her white prairie dress catching on dew-wet grass, and she saw that the ranch beyond the house was far larger than she had been led to imagine. There were fenced pastures stretching into the distance, herds moving like dark waves, and men working with the efficiency of a well-funded operation. "This is not a poor ranch," Lien said quietly, her voice tight. Elias did not deny it. He led her past barns that were newer than his wagon, past a stable filled with strong horses, and toward a low rise where the land opened like a secret being revealed. Below them, a valley held rows of storage buildings, rail spurs, and stacks of lumber and/or sacks that did not belong to ordinary cattle work. Lien stared, the truth landing in her chest with a heavy shock. "What is this?" she demanded, and the seriousness in her voice made it sound like a charge in court. Elias's hands clenched at his sides. "What my family built," he said. "What they kill to keep." Lien turned to him, eyes burning. "You lied," she said, and the betrayal tasted sharp, because she had accepted hardship willingly, but she had not consented to deception. Elias's gaze held hers, and for the first time he let raw honesty surface. "I lied because the last woman who came here learned the truth too quickly," he said, and the admission struck like a sudden slap. "And after she learned it, she disappeared." Lien's stomach dropped. "You told me she died," she whispered. Elias's voice tightened. "I told you what I needed you to believe on the road," he said, and his expression twisted with something that looked like shame. Lien's hands trembled, but she forced them still. "Are you protecting me?" she asked. "Or are you using me?" Elias stepped closer, careful not to touch her, as though he feared she might break or flee. "I have wanted to protect you since the moment I read your letter," he said, and the sincerity in his tone startled her, because it sounded like a confession he did not want to make. "I saw a woman fighting to live, and I thought I could offer a safer cage than the one chasing you." Lien's eyes stung, not with weakness, but with anger at being treated like an object moved between hands. "A cage is still a cage," she said. Elias's gaze dropped to the hem of her dress, damp with mourning, and then lifted again with a slow, aching restraint. "Then help me break it," he said. Lien felt the dangerous pull of that sentence, because it offered partnership instead of possession, and yet it demanded trust from a man who had already lied. In the distance, a rider approached at speed, and Elias's posture changed instantly, protective in a way that looked practiced. The rider dismounted and spoke in a low rush. "Mrs. Mercer wants you in the study," he said to Elias, then glanced at Lien as though she were already a subject in the message. "And Mr. Vane is expected by noon." Elias's face hardened. Lien caught the name. "Who is Vane?" she asked. Elias's voice went flat. "Horace Vane," he said. "A man who smiles like a friend and bites like a wolf." Lien's mind raced, connecting Clara's warning to Silas's whispers, to Abigail's cold control, to the hidden valley of wealth beneath the hill. She realized that the truth she sought was not a single secret, but a web, and she had stepped into its center wearing a white dress that made her impossible to ignore. Yet when Elias looked at her again, there was a flicker of something tender beneath the darkness, as if he hated the danger but could not stop wanting her close. "Stay near me today," he said softly, and though it was an instruction, it carried the intimate weight of concern. Lien's heart did not trust him fully, but it answered anyway, because in that moment she understood that romance here would not arrive like sunshine, but like a lantern carried through a storm, small, stubborn, and painfully bright. When Abigail summoned Elias to the study, Lien insisted on walking beside him, and he did not stop her, though his tension tightened as they approached the heavy door. The corridor outside the study felt colder than the rest of the house, and the portraits along the walls looked harsher here, as if the men painted into them had guarded this threshold even after death. A servant opened the door, then retreated quickly, and Lien saw Abigail seated behind a desk with papers laid out like traps. Silas Crow stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, and his eyes sharpened with a calculating satisfaction when he saw Lien had come. Abigail did not rise. "Elias," she said, then let her gaze settle on Lien like a weight. "And the bride who forgets her place." Lien kept her face composed. "My place is beside my husband," she answered, and the words sounded formal enough to be acceptable, even while they defied Abigail's control. Elias's jaw flexed, but he did not contradict Lien. Abigail tapped a document with one precise finger. "This requires a signature," she said to Lien, and the casual cruelty of her tone made the demand feel inevitable. Silas stepped forward smoothly. "A simple legal assurance," he said. "It protects the Mercer holdings from predatory interests." Lien did not reach for the paper. "Let me read it," she said. Silas's smile tightened. "It is written in proper legal language," he warned, as if her comprehension would inconvenience him. Lien's eyes stayed on the page. "Then it will not fear being read," she replied. Elias exhaled slowly, and Lien felt, without looking, that he was bracing for a conflict he had delayed too long. Abigail's expression hardened. "You are bold," Abigail said. "Boldness breaks easily when it meets consequences." Lien lifted her chin. "I have already met consequences," she said quietly. "That is why I am still standing." Elias finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Mother," he said. "Do not threaten her." Abigail's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do not lecture me on threats," she replied. "You were born into them." Lien's fingers hovered over the document, then withdrew. "If this is to protect the family," she said, "why does it require my name?" Silas's eyes flashed with irritation before he masked it. "Because marriage creates legal ties," he answered. "A wife's signature can close gaps that enemies exploit." Lien's mind returned to the hidden valley and the rail spurs, two or sacks that suggested a mine, to wealth that did not match Elias's worn coat. "Enemies like Horace Vane," she said, testing the name like a key in a lock. Abigail's gaze sharpened. "You will not speak his name with familiarity," she snapped. Elias's posture shifted, as if he were placing himself between Lien and his mother's rage. "Vane is coming," Elias said. "So you must tell me what you intend, because I will not be blindsided again." Abigail's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Lien saw not only cold control, but fear, deep and disciplined. "Horace Vane believes he can take what belongs to us," Abigail said. "He believes our family is vulnerable," Silas added smoothly. "He will attempt charm first, then pressure, then scandal." Lien's stomach tightened. "And if he cannot take it politely," she asked, "what happens?" Abigail's voice turned icy. "Then we remind him that some doors open only one way," she said. Lien felt the warning settle into her bones. She looked at Elias. "Is that what happened to the woman before?" she asked softly. Elias's face tightened like a fist. "Do not," Abigail warned, but Lien did not stop. Elias's eyes held pain, and then he looked away as if he could not bear to meet her gaze while lying. The silence was an answer. Lien's breath came shallow. "I will not sign," she said. Silas's polite mask cracked. "You do not understand the stakes," he said sharply. Lien's voice remained steady. "Then explain them honestly," she said. Without hiding behind paper, Abigail rose slowly, and the room seemed to shrink under her authority. "You will learn," she said. "That honesty is a luxury for people who are not hunted." Elias stepped forward, his voice low but dangerous. "She is not your weapon," he said. Abigail's eyes cut into him. "And you are not your own man," she replied. Lien watched Elias's restraint tremble, and in that tremble she saw how much he had been trained to obey. Yet when his hand lifted, not to touch her, but to gesture toward the door, it was an invitation to leave together, and that small act carried the fragile, growing shape of loyalty. Lien followed him out, heart pounding, because she realized the romance she wanted would be inseparable from the danger she feared, and every tender moment would be earned against a house that wanted to swallow them both. Night returned to the Mercer house with a patience that felt deliberate, as though it waited to see who would break first, and Lien stood at the window of the room that was now hers, watching lanterns move across the distant yard like cautious stars. The events of the day pressed against her thoughts, each revelation settling into place with unsettling clarity. Yet beneath the fear there was another sensation she could not dismiss, a slow, steady awareness of Elias's presence even when he was not beside her. When a soft knock came at the door, she did not startle, because she recognized the rhythm, hesitant but purposeful. "Lien?" Elias said quietly through the wood, and her name sounded different in his voice, less formal, more careful. She opened the door and found him without his coat, sleeves rolled to his forearms, the scars on his hands more visible in the lamplight. "You should not be here," she said, though she did not step aside. Elias met her gaze. "I should be exactly where I am," he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, only resolve. She let him enter, closing the door softly behind him, as if sealing the moment away from the house's listening walls. For a time neither spoke, and the silence was heavy but not hostile, filled instead with the weight of everything they had not yet said. Elias finally broke it. "I did not plan to care," he admitted. "I thought distance would keep you safe." Lien crossed her arms, not defensively, but to steady herself. "Distance has never kept me safe," she said. "Only truth has." Elias nodded slowly. "Then I will give you truth," he said, and he told her everything he had withheld. About the mine hidden beneath the ranch, about Abigail's ruthless bargains, about the woman who had come before Lien and learned too much too fast. His voice did not soften the facts, and when he finished, the room felt stripped bare. Lien listened without interruption, and when he fell silent, she said quietly, "You should have trusted me sooner." Elias's expression tightened. "I was afraid you would leave," he confessed, and the vulnerability in the admission surprised them both. Lien studied him, the brooding man shaped by a legacy he did not choose, and felt something shift inside her chest. "I am still here," she said. "That should tell you something." Elias took a cautious step closer, stopping as if asking permission without words. "It tells me everything," he replied, and the space between them felt charged with a tenderness that neither had expected to survive the danger. He did not touch her then, but his closeness warmed the air, and Lien realized that romance did not always arrive with grand gestures, but sometimes with quiet honesty offered at risk. The next day brought Horace Vane like a storm dressed as a gentleman, his arrival announced by polished boots and a smile that carried entitlement beneath its charm. Lien observed him from Elias's side, noting how his gaze lingered too long, how his words slid around truths instead of meeting them. Abigail hosted him with brittle courtesy, Silas hovering like a shadow, and the tension in the room was sharp enough to taste. When Vane finally turned his attention to Lien, offering a compliment that felt like a test, she met it with calm deflection, refusing to give him the reaction he sought. Elias's hand brushed hers beneath the table, not an embrace, but a quiet assurance, and the contact sent a steadying warmth through her. Later, when Vane attempted to corner her in the hall, his tone shifting from polite interest to thinly veiled threat, Lien held her ground. "I am not for sale," she said evenly. "And this house is not as defenseless as you believe." Vane's smile faltered, and something like respect flickered in his eyes before it hardened into calculation. The confrontation ended not with violence, but with exposure, as evidence Silas had hidden was revealed through Lien's careful reading and Clara's trembling courage, forcing Vane to retreat under the scrutiny of the justice figure, who arrived sooner than Abigail had planned. When the danger finally loosened its grip, the house seemed to exhale, its oppressive presence diminished by the truth brought into the open. In the quiet that followed, Lien found Elias in the stable at dusk, the air filled with the smell of hay and earth, a simple scent that felt like promise. He was brushing one of the horses with slow, thoughtful strokes, and when he turned, his guarded expression softened at the sight of her. "It is over," she said, and the words carried relief and disbelief in equal measure. Elias nodded. "For now," he replied, "but the future will be different." Lien stepped closer, the hem of her white prairie dress catching the golden light, and reached out, resting her hand against his chest. He stilled instantly, breath-catching, as if afraid to move and break the moment. "Different can be good," she said softly. Elias's hand lifted, hovering near her waist without touching. "Only if you stay," he said, the admission bare and unguarded. Lien met his eyes, seeing the man beneath the legacy, the protector beneath the deception. "I will stay," she said. "But not in a cage." Elias nodded, understanding clear in his gaze. "Then we will build something honest," he said. When he finally drew her into his arms, the embrace was careful, reverent, as though he understood the weight of her trust. Lien rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. And for the first time since her journey began, she allowed herself to believe in a future shaped by choice rather than fear. The romance between them did not erase the scars of the past, but it stood beside them, resilient and hopeful, a quiet promise forged in truth and earned through courage.